Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm going to give you a moment to connect to audio here, but come on in. Welcome, welcome. All right, looks like just a few more people are connecting to audio. Okay, well, why don't we get started? Welcome to this First Friday lecture for the basic program of liberal education for adults. My name is Noah Shafitz. I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Our speaker today is basic program instructor David Shiner, and David's lecture is entitled Philosophy Before Socrates. This First Friday lecture is supported by the Anaxagoras Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anaxagoras. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that follows it, you will not be able to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for David in the chat box at any time during the lecture, and David will have a chance to respond to your questions afterward. I will read them to David. During the lecture, David and I will be able to see only a handful of video feeds, so you may choose to leave your video on or turn it off at your discretion. David's video will be spotlighted, so the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Before I give David a full introduction, let me tell you a little bit about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing and Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, the basic program has offered students a rigorous education in the liberal arts through direct engagement with original texts in discussion-based courses led by highly dedicated instructors. At the heart of the basic program is our four-year core sequence, which offers first-hand encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners. Registration for the winter quarter is ongoing, and our sections have a tendency to fill up quickly, so I recommend that you reserve your spots as soon as you can if you haven't done so already. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on December 5th. Our speaker on the 5th will be basic program instructor Jacqueline Victor. The title of Jacqueline's lecture will be The City of Ladies. Today's speaker, basic program instructor David Shiner, is professor emeritus at Shimer College, where he taught for 40 years and served several terms as dean of the college. At Shimer, David taught all 16 required courses on subjects as distinct as literature, chemistry, psychology, and politics, and he teaches a similarly wide range of core courses and alumni sequence courses for the basic program. He has written on the dialogues of Plato, the philosophy of the French Enlightenment, on game theory, on economics, and on paradox. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Pacific Miramar University, and he has a special interest in classics, especially classical philosophy, which is the topic of his lecture today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to David. David, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Noah. I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone being here. Hope to make it worth your while. We'll start with a little screen share here. Okay. So, philosophy before Socrates. So I'm going to begin by mentioning that it's not typical for First Friday lectures to start with a confession, but I'm going to do that because I think I need to. I need to tell you that part of this lecture has been plagiarized. But I wouldn't get too scandalized about this because I plagiarized it for myself. You see, a couple of years ago, I gave a First Friday lecture, which I imagine some of you have seen, about the transition from mythology to philosophy, particularly in ancient Greece, although not exclusively. And I'm not going to rehash the bulk of that lecture today, but I am going to include a few comments that I made back then, because it's not really possible to appreciate the innovation of philosophy before Socrates without understanding something about that transition. So if you were present for that lecture, or if you watched it online afterward, some of what I'm about to say might sound familiar, but I promise it won't be all that much. So, philosophy before Socrates. I don't think I have tell anyone here that I'm having trouble moving my screen. There we go. That Socrates was the first really important figure in ancient Greek philosophy, but he wasn't the first one. Philosophical thought in the ancient Greek world is commonly considered to have begun around 600 BC. So as you look at the dates of Socrates' life, which we don't know exactly but are pretty close, was about 2 centuries before Socrates died. The philosophers from that early period are generally referred to as the pre-Socratics. So that's a term I'll be using quite a bit today. Since the time of Aristotle, some 2,400 years ago, it's been generally agreed that the first Greek philosopher was a man named Thales. Thales hailed from Miletus, a wealthy and culturally advanced city in Asia Minor in the western part of present-day Turkey, kind of toward the southwest. I'll be showing you where it is on a map later on. Thales was one of the renowned 7 sages of Greece who flourished during the first half of the 6th century BC. In order to understand why Aristotle and everyone since then has regarded Thales as the founding member of the pre-Socratic clan, so to speak, we need to understand how his thought represented a major departure from previous mythological thinking. And here's where my plagiarism is going to begin, although it's going to end pretty quickly. The oldest known written versions of ancient Greek myths are those written by Homer and by Hesiod. Homer, who did the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Hesiod, who authored several works. Hesiod probably wrote sometime after Homer, but certainly well before any of the pre-Socratic philosophers, probably about a century before Thales. Hesiod's poem Theogony offers a comprehensive mythological account of the origins of the universe. He begins that account as follows. First, chaos came to be, but next wise-bosomed Gaia, Earth, the ever-sure foundations of all the deathless ones who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus, and dim Tartarus, abyss, in the depth of the wide path Gaia, Earth, and Eros, love, fairest among the deathless gods, who unnerves the limbs and overcomes the mind, and wise counsels of all gods and all men within them. From chaos came forth Erebos, which is shadow, and dark Nyx, night. But of Nyx were born Ether, the sky, and Hemera, day, whom she conceived and bore from union and love with Erebos. And Gaia first bore starry Uranus, which is heaven, equal to herself, to cover her on every side, and to be an ever-sure abiding place for the blessed gods. She brought forth long mountains, beautiful shelters, and so forth and so on. And I ended with the gods here. I think that's enough for you to get that Hesiod's account of the origins of the universe is also a story of the origins of the gods. The gods are named for the things of the universe, and that's why it's called a theogony. Theos, the gods, Goni, Genesis, origins of gods. Every aspect of the universe is identified with the distinct characteristics of its respective god or goddess. There's no appeal to anything we would recognize today as evidence, nor is the story subject to critical scrutiny or disverification, as would be the case with a modern scientific hypothesis. Like Homer, Hesiod begins his poem with an invocation to the Muses. That's earlier in the poem than what I quoted here. And the reader is evidently expected to accept the account on the authority of the Muses as channeled through their human author. Now let's contrast Hesiod's account with the origin story proposed by Thales of Miletus. Thales is thought to have believed that the origin of everything in the universe was water. This is obviously a different type of account than Hesiod's. Thales was undoubtedly familiar with the work of his predecessors, including Hesiod, but as far as we know, he never attributed the origin, control, or composition of the cosmos to the gods, but rather to a material substance, namely water. From the perspective of intellectual history, this was a major innovation. Aristotle, writing about 250 years later, begins his investigation of the thinkers who preceded him with Thales, whom he describes as the founder of philosophy. And Thales has been regarded that way ever since. Now, the word philosopher means lover of wisdom, and Aristotle explicitly reserved the term wisdom for those who had what he called knowledge of certain principles and causes, unquote, which does not include those who recited ancient myths. So by this definition, the definition of the philosopher, Thales was much wiser in Aristotle's eyes than Homer or Hesiod. And while Aristotle finds grounds in some of his works for praising Homer, it's never for his wisdom. Aristotle explicitly distinguishes Thales from earlier writers, such as Hesiod, who had used, again, Aristotle's words, mythical language throughout, unquote. It's important to note that Aristotle doesn't say that Thales and the philosophers who succeeded him never used mythical language, which would be entirely false, but only that they're distinguishable from those who always did. In fact, in one of his works, Aristotle notes the similarity between Thales's claims about water and a myth which is recounted by Hesiod, associating water with the union of the Titans, Oceanus and Tethys. But Aristotle regarded that similarity as being philosophically irrelevant. Later pre-Socratic philosophers also referred to supernatural beings, as we'll see later on, but not in the way they were invoked by earlier poets such as Homer and Hesiod. And any speculations the pre-Socratics offered on the origins of the universe were likewise far removed from earlier mythic creation stories. They occasionally invoked gods, but their gods were decisively different from the gods of mythology, and we'll see examples of that later on. The origin and composition of the natural world was central to the concerns of all the pre-Socratics. Much of what we know about what they believed involves their speculations about what we would call nature, the Greek word for which is physis, from which we get our word physics. Thus, much of their work could be regarded as the beginnings of natural philosophy, which was the preferred term for the study of nature until the 19th century. But almost all of them tackled other topics too, as we shall see. Before diving more deeply into the ideas of the pre-Socratics, I should mention that in most cases, it's hard to say much about what any of them believed without some degree of speculation. That's because no pre-Socratic text has survived in more than fragmentary form, and in most cases, not even that. So most of what we know about these early thinkers and their ideas was through accounts from writers who came along later, in most cases, several centuries later. We do have some direct quotations, which classicists refer to as fragments, for some of them. We also have a number of summaries of their views by those who studied their original works when they were still available, and those are referred to as testimonia. Fortunately, those later commentators largely agree with each other about what the pre-Socratic philosophers said, which supports the belief that what's come down to us is by and large authentic. Okay, so back to Thales. As I mentioned earlier, he's credited with the view that water was the origin of everything in the universe. No direct evidence has survived concerning how Thales would have justified that claim, if in fact he did it at all. Aristotle, whose picture is here on the right, hazards this tentative opinion. He, Thales, may have gotten the idea from seeing that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that even the hot itself comes to be and lives on this, getting the idea from this consideration, and also because the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is the principle of moist things. So that's the educated guess of a master philosopher who lived much closer to Thales' time than we do, but it's still only a guess. He may have gotten the idea. Thales' reputation for wisdom in the ancient world was not based on his views about water or Aristotle's views of his status as the first Greek philosopher, which came much later, but rather on stories that were told about his practical intelligence and acumen. The most famous of these was an event recounted by the historian Herodotus some 150 years after it was supposed to have taken place. It runs like this. And again, this is what Herodotus is supposed to have looked like, not Thales. So here's the story Herodotus tells in Book 1 of his history. War broke out between the Lydians and the Medes and continued for 5 years with various success. In the course of it, the Medes gained many victories over the Lydians, and the Lydians also gained many victories over the Medes. Among their other battles, there was one night engagement. As, however, the balance had not inclined in favor of either nation, another combat took place in the 6th year, in the course of which, just as the battle was growing warm, day was suddenly changed into night. This event had been foretold by Thales, the Milesian, who forewarned the Ionians of it, fixing for it the very year in which it actually took place. The Medes and the Lydians, when they observed the change, ceased fighting and were alike anxious to have terms of peace agreed on. Well, later scholarship has debated whether this event actually took place, and in fact, it's even been argued that it wouldn't have been possible for Thales or anyone else to have predicted a solar eclipse at that time. But regardless whether it happened as Herodotus said, or approximately as Herodotus said, it was evidently another instance of Thales' reliance on material causation, as contrasted with the superstitious response to the eclipse exhibited by the soldiers, who, Herodotus implies, interpreted the darkening of the skies as an ominous message for the gods, which is why they no longer wanted to fight. Other stories about Thales, told by Aristotle among others, also attest to his great reputation for wisdom. Still, what interests us here today is Thales' status as a philosopher, which is based primarily on his claim that the origin and core principle of existing things was water and not some deity. Thales' successors were well aware of the limitations of that claim, but they too regarded the core principle of existing things as something material. His countryman Anaximander, a younger colleague and perhaps student of Thales, argued that no known material element, not water or anything else, could account for everything in the universe. According to Simplicius, a commentator writing 1,000 years later, and apparently the last major scholar who had access to many of the original pre-Socratic texts, Anaximander believed that the first principle of everything existing, as we see in the slide, quote, is neither water nor any of the other things called elements, but some other nature, which is Apeiron, out of which come to be all the heavens and the worlds in them. The word Apeiron is not easy to translate. It means approximately something indefinite or boundless. According to Anaximander, the Apeiron is eternal and in perpetual motion, so that it's able to account not only for all material things, but also for all change in the universe. So it refers not only to the origin of the universe, but also to its changing composition through the ages. Like Thales, and like many of the other pre-Socratic philosophers who came after them, Anaximander speculated about astronomical matters as well. He's said to have held that the stars and the planets are carried in their orbits by circles and spheres on which each one is mounted. That notion of celestial spheres that carry the planets and stars subsequently became the dominant view of astronomers until at least the time of Galileo and Kepler, which was more than 2,000 years later. Anaximander also claimed that human beings had evolved from animals of a different kind, apparently reasoning that since we humans are the only species who require a lengthy period of nursing, we couldn't have survived if we'd been like we are now from the beginning of time. While there are certainly problems with that line of reasoning, the fact remains that it is a line of reasoning rather than a mythological account or some other sort of dogmatic claim. The third and last of the pre-Socratics from Miletus, the major pre-Socratics, Anaximenes, was a younger colleague and perhaps a student of Anaximander. He agreed with both Thales and Anaximander that there's a single basic stuff of which the universe consists, but he disagreed with them about what it was. According to Anaximenes, that basic stuff is aer, A-E-R. Well, that's a word that's naturally enough translated usually as air, which is probably the best we can do. But aer, A-E-R, is more like a dense mist than our air, which we usually think of as being basically transparent. Now, Anaximenes' speculation about air, and as you can see with the dates of all these, we're not really clear when they were born and died. These are the best we can do, at least presently. So Anaximenes' speculations about air might simply look like a difference of opinion from his predecessors, right? You say water, I say air, but from the testimony we have, Anaximenes actually made a rather significant advance because he gave an account for why his favorite principle was superior to those of his predecessors. According to Aristotle's star pupil, Theophrastus, much later, of course, Anaximenes' air, quote, from the slide, differs in rarity and density according to the substances it becomes. When it thins out and expands, it becomes fire. When it's condensed, it comes to be wind, then cloud, and when still further condensed, it becomes water, then earth, then stones, and the rest come to be from these. Now, this is essentially a rudimentary scientific theory, a claim that the basic stuff of the universe, namely air, can account for everything that exists due to condensation and rarefaction. Furthermore, the later Greek scholar Plutarch, writing about a century after Christ, cited empirical evidence in support of Anaximenes' claim, evidence which it appears likely that Anaximenes offered himself. In the words of Plutarch, the breath becomes cold when compressed and condensed by the lips, and when the mouth is relaxed, the escaping breath becomes warm because of rareness. You all can try this at home, right? You blow air out of your mouth. If you make your mouth smaller, you close your lips, your breath automatically becomes cooler. Wide lips, warmer air. Condensed when you put your lips together, smaller orifice. When you make them wide, it becomes rarer, more like fire, and the opposite direction, more like a proto-solid. Okay, so the accounts of Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes were not exactly sophisticated by our standards, or even by the standards of their immediate successors, let alone the likes of Plato and Aristotle. But again, they were decisively different from the theistic explanations offered by mythology. Thus, they're regarded as the first pre-Socratic philosophers, as well as spearheading what is sometimes referred to as the first scientific revolution. So before going on from these three Miletan philosophers, I want to say a little more about the term philosopher. The word was rarely used by the pre-Socratics, very sparingly, and it's certainly not how they thought of themselves. While it's true that Heraclitus, who came along about 50 years after Anaximenes, used the term when he said that those who are philosophers must be inquirers into many things, and philosophers clearly means lovers of wisdom, as it does later on. The word philosopher for Heraclitus doesn't have the technical sense that it acquires in the works of Plato, Aristotle, and their successors, where the philosopher is contrasted with both the ordinary person and with other would-be experts, such as poets, orators, or, in the works of Plato, sophists, who claim to be philosophers, or at least some do. Or, of course, in the modern sense in which we distinguish philosophy from subjects like physics, astronomy, psychology, and so on. As this line from Heraclitus suggests, the early Greek philosophers thought of themselves as inquirers into many things, and the range of their inquiry was vast. They were philosophers in the sense expressed by Aristotle in the quote I showed earlier, in that their goal was the attainment of wisdom by means that set them apart from others, including those who wrote mythologically. The questions that preoccupied the early Greek philosophers, the kinds of answers they gave, of which we've already seen an early sample, and the methods by which at least some of them achieved those answers or came to those answers, were the foundation for the development of philosophy as it came to be defined in the works of their successors. So Heraclitus was the first Greek writer to have been known to use the term philosopher. And he's a good example of this new way of thinking. Although Heraclitus, who hailed from Ephesus in present-day Turkey, asserts that those who love wisdom must be inquirers into many things, inquiry alone, he said, is not sufficient. He regularly rebukes his predecessors, chiefly the likes of Homer and Hesiod, but also older contemporaries who have since come to be regarded as pre-Socratic philosophers, like Heraclitus. For example, he wrote in a fragment that we have without further explanation, "Much learning does not teach understanding, else it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and also Xenophanes and Hecataeus." Well, we know who Hesiod is, but who are these other guys? Well, Hecataeus was an early historian, but Pythagoras of Samos and Xenophanes of Colophon, which are not far from Ephesus, were among those who later became to be regarded as pre-Socratic philosophers. All four of them were celebrated in their time, and except for Hesiod, their time was only a few years before Heraclitus. And according to Heraclitus, they had much learning. But also according to Heraclitus, they failed to grasp the deeper significance of what they'd learned, so that their extensive learning did not constitute understanding, let alone wisdom. As Heraclitus suggests elsewhere, he alone truly understands all things, because he grasps the underlying principle of reality, the logos, that explains everything. While Heraclitus's account, which includes the claim that fire is the fundamental stuff of the universe, is very different from any of his predecessors, he was similar to the other pre-Socratics in that he believed he'd seen the true nature of reality, although they all disagreed about what that is. Okay, so I've mentioned some time frame and some locations, but I'm going to do a little bit with a timeline and a map so I can give you a better idea of the range of times we're talking about and places. So I mentioned we're going to talk about the 6th and 5th century BC Greek philosophers coming up to Socrates. All the dates of them are approximate, so I didn't bother putting question marks. But Thales of Miletus is thought to have flourished early 6th century BC. Anaximander, his countryman, possibly student, somewhat younger. Anaximenes, again about a generation younger than Anaximander. Pythagoras of Samos. Xenophanes of Colophon, a bit younger than Anaximenes. And Heraclitus, another generation younger than those two. And those are the 6 I've mentioned so far as the early philosophers. And once I talk more about Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Heraclitus, we'll move into the 5th century philosophers. So here's a map of the world of the pre-Socratic philosophers that might help you get a sense of the location. We think of the Greek philosophy is centered around Athens, and there's a lot of good reason for that, but that's largely somewhat later. We're looking at Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and we see Miletus here, and then above them, the island of Samos, where Pythagoras hailed from, Ephesus, where Heraclitus was from, and Colophon for Xenophanes. Later, we'll see Anaxagoras from Clazomenae and so forth. And over time, these philosophers journeyed more and more to Athens, and later on, some of them wound up living there. You also see some of the famous cities of ancient Greece: Thebes, northeast of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, and so forth. So a little bit of timeline and geography there. So we've seen that Heraclitus was criticizing Pythagoras and Xenophanes, but what was he criticizing them for? Well, he doesn't say, so it's not easy to know. Concerning Pythagoras, no quotations from him have survived. And the testimony about him consists largely of brief ethical pronouncements. Most of them, such as abstain from beans and don't urinate facing the sun, would not have been sufficient to merit Pythagoras being characterized as a philosopher, at least not without some explanation of why we should refrain from doing those things. But that's not why Pythagoras was widely venerated for wisdom in his day, and to some extent still is today. Pythagoras was and is thought to have been the founder of a movement. Nothing reliable is known about him as a person, and in fact, contemporary scholars are more likely to refer to the Pythagoreans than to Pythagoras himself. The movement which bears his name involved fidelity to ethical strictures as much as philosophical speculation. The philosophic part of the views of Pythagoras involve mathematics rather than, say, beans or urination or the sun. We're familiar with Pythagoras, regardless of what else we know about him, from the famous Pythagorean theorem, which we see here. ABC in a triangle, the angle between line A and line B is intended to show it's a right angle, which means C is the hypotenuse of the triangle. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared. That works out arithmetically, although it was originally proven geometrically. So this is the way in which Pythagoras' name is immortalized these days in this theorem. And the Pythagoreans are in fact thought to have made a number of other important mathematical discoveries. But the status of Pythagorean thought had little to do with mathematical theorems, but rather to the metaphysical use to which they were put. As Aristotle put it, the Pythagoreans, quote, believed that its principles, mathematics principles, are the principles of all the things that are. Since they saw the attributes of musical scales and numbers, and other things seemed to be made in the likeness of numbers in their entire nature, they supposed the elements of numbers to be the elements of all the things that are, unquote. In other words, the Pythagoreans reasoned that the entire universe is a harmonious arrangement. You may have heard the idea of harmony of the spheres, and that number is the key to that harmony. The extensive use of mathematics in contemporary science has its distant progenitor in Pythagorean views on the subject, although of course not with the same conclusions in most cases. The other philosopher who Heraclitus spoke disparagingly of, Xenophanes of Colophon, took an entirely different approach to that of Pythagoras. Part of what distinguished Xenophanes from other pre-Socratics was that he explicitly debunked the mythographers. He did this partly on ethical grounds when he stated, the first quotation, Homer and Hesiod say that the gods do all manner of things which men would consider disgraceful: adultery, stealing, deceiving each other. Those of you who've read the Iliad, to some extent the Odyssey, know exactly what Xenophanes is talking about here. And that statement anticipates the much more developed critique made repeatedly by Socrates in Plato's works, and by legions ever since, namely, that a true God could not be unjust or immoral, or have any of the other less savory traits that were characteristic of the mythical gods and goddesses. To Xenophanes, Socrates, and the rest of the emerging philosophic crew, an unjust God was a contradiction in terms. Xenophanes' surviving fragments show that he believed in a deity or deities, hard to tell if it's singular or plural, but ones that are responsible only for ordering the universe, not for directing it, and not for interfering in human affairs. Xenophanes also extolled the veneration of wisdom at the expense of more traditional virtues, such as success in combat or in sporting events. As he wrote, sorry, that didn't don't have a slide for this, but I'll just read it. It's not right to put strength ahead of wisdom, which is good. It's not right to put strength ahead of wisdom, which is good. Oh, yes, it's the second quotation here. All right. So note the juxtaposition here of wisdom and goodness in that statement, such that wisdom in the philosophy of Xenophanes is an ethical virtue. But like all the pre-Socratics, Xenophanes also talked a lot about physical phenomena, like his philosophic predecessors, and he gave them materialistic rather than mythological explanations. And at times, he went even further than his predecessors by explicitly contrasting his account with earlier mythological ones. In his commentary on Homer's Iliad, for example, he wrote this: "She whom they call Iris, this too is by nature cloud, purple and red and greenish yellow to behold." Now, Iris was both the rainbow and the messenger goddess, and Xenophanes' statement is usually taken to indicate his opposition to the mythological idea of the rainbow's divine origin and significance, in favor of a material explanation. So we can see that the things that Heraclitus, Xenophanes, and Pythagoras, or the Pythagorean school, claimed were very different from each other, but we shouldn't underestimate their similarities. In each case, they appear to have held views that most of us would regard as somewhat dogmatic, even when they gave evidence for their claims, because the evidence they gave was rarely sufficient for the actual views. Another aspect which they had in common was that all of their accounts of first principles in nature implied that our senses deceive us. What I mean by that is this: it's not obvious to us that everything we perceive is composed entirely of water, or air, or fire, or any particular element. And of course it isn't. But there was always an early pre-Socratic philosopher who claimed that it was. But regardless of those differences, all of them agreed in claiming that the multiplicity of material objects that we encounter, that we perceive, are in fact composed of a single material substance. Their accounts increasingly relied on logic at the expense of perception. That is to say, they were more trying to figure out what must be underlying, regardless of what could be perceived. So it was inevitable that someone would take an even more radical stance on the dichotomy between appearance and reality, and that someone was a man named Parmenides. And now we're moving into the 5th century BC. Parmenides flourished about a century after Thales. The only work of his that we possess, and of course that's only in part, is a poem that's written in the Homeric style, and it includes many Homeric style images, but its content is anything but Homeric. Here's how it begins. "The mares which carried me as far as my spirit ever aspired were escorting me, when they brought me and proceeded along the renowned route of the goddess, which brings a knowing mortal to all cities one by one. On this route I was being brought. On it wise mares were bringing me, straining the chariot, and maidens were guiding the way." After a few more lines, the narrator or protagonist meets the goddess. She receives him kindly and tells him, "It is right that you will learn all things." And fortunately for him, she's the one who's going to teach him. So what the goddess teaches Parmenides, or whoever the protagonist of the poem is, comprises the first part of his poem, which is entitled "The Way of Truth." To summarize, the goddess's doctrine is that truth must be judged by reason rather than by sense perception, because sense perception is deceptive. And reason tells us that there's no such thing as becoming, only being. For if anything comes to be, it must come out of either what being, that is what already is, or out of not being, what is not, right? Being, essentially existence, not being, non-existence. Being something, not being nothing. If that which comes to be comes out of being, it already exists. So it actually didn't come to be, it was already here. If it comes out of not being, it's nothing, because not being is nothing, and nothing can come from nothing. So becoming doesn't actually exist according to Parmenides, which means all change is illusory. A similar argument leads to the conclusion that there are not many things in existence, but only one. This one might be called reality or being, but whatever it's called, logically it couldn't be otherwise according to Parmenides, because if it was other than being, it would be not being, which again is nothing. That's the way of truth. The second part of Parmenides' poem is called The Way of Opinion, doxa. There he talks about planets, stars, animals, and many of the other things we think of as constituting our universe. The purpose of the way of opinion is a matter of debate among scholars, but although it employs the same flowery language as the way of truth, the content is undeniably different. In short, the substance of the first part of Parmenides' poem, The Way of Truth, is purely logical, although it's cloaked in mythical language, while the second part is an extended reflection on the world we perceive. The logical part is truth, the empirical or perceptual part is opinion. It's important to realize that regardless of the mythological Parmenides uses in his poem, starting with the little fragment that I showed that's on the screen, the content is again antithetical to mythological concepts. The gods of Greek mythology were embodied, finite, and anthropomorphic. They could not possibly be identified with the unchanging, motionless one being, as he says, it is, of Parmenides. The name of a god such as Zeus might be applied to the one, as happens in later Greek thought. But this Zeus is nothing like the one who plays a major role in the tales of the likes of Homer and Hesiod. And this seems to have been true of all the pre-Socratics. Perhaps Heraclitus put it best when he wrote that wisdom itself, quote, is both unwilling and willing to be called by the name of Zeus. Now, the notion that reality is one and that change doesn't exist is not exactly the kind of idea that occurs to the person on the street regularly. And it didn't appeal much to Parmenides' contemporaries either, so his views were widely called into question. But Parmenides also had his defenders, and one of them was a clever lad by the name of Zeno, who you might know of because of his famous paradoxes. In one of Plato's dialogues, aptly entitled Parmenides, the young Socrates meets the aging Parmenides and his disciple Zeno, who's about a generation younger than Parmenides, or at least we think so, and he's characterized in that way in Plato's dialogue. Socrates hazards an hypothesis that Zeno's writings were efforts to support Parmenides' views, and Zeno agrees, saying this: "These writings of mine were meant to protect the arguments of Parmenides against those who make fun of him and seek to show the many ridiculous and contradictory results which they suppose to follow from the affirmation of the one. My answer is addressed to the partisans of the many, whose attack I return with interest, by retorting upon them that their hypothesis of the being of many, if carried out, appears to be still more ridiculous than the hypothesis of the being of one." Now, this is Plato's recounting of what he imagines Zeno to have said at a time before he was born, but the notion of what Zeno was trying to accomplish has been generally agreed on by subsequent philosophers. Now, I realize that this passage seems pretty abstract, so I'm going to give an example to show what it was that Zeno thought he was doing in defending Parmenides. So, Aristotle referred to several paradoxes of Zeno, as did subsequent authors. And here's one of the most famous. On the left, you have Achilles, the great warrior, the hero, villain, I guess, of the Iliad, who has his spear and he's about to kill all the Trojans, apparently. And he's also referred to by Homer as the swiftest of all the Greek heroes. Very, very fast runner, makes Usain Bolt look slow by comparison. Below to the right, we have a rather taciturn-looking tortoise who, as you can see, is probably not really a match for Achilles when it comes to any kind of sports, particularly running. So Zeno says, let's suppose there's a race. So we look over here on the right. And Achilles is starting from this point in the upper left of this whole diagram. The tortoise is starting at this middle line. And before Achilles even starts, the tortoise gets more of a head start. Achilles then gets to where the tortoise started, only to find that not only does he have to get to where the tortoise was when he started, but he has to get even a little further. And of course, this continues, right? Every time Achilles reaches the spot where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a little further ahead. Granted, the amount further ahead it has moved gets shorter all the time, but it never disappears entirely because Achilles always has to reach the spot the tortoise left before continuing to try to catch up. It would therefore take an infinite number of movements in order for Achilles to catch up to the tortoise. Since no one can complete an infinite number of movements in a finite amount of time, Achilles is destined to play catch-up forever. Now, I think it's generally believed when people hear this that Zeno's claiming that, the faster runner never catches up with the slower one. But in fact, Zeno's aim is much different. As he states in Plato's dialogue, his point is that the whole paradox results from a false assumption, namely that there's such a thing as motion. And that is exactly what his mentor Parmenides is denying. If there's no becoming, there can be no motion. Zeno's point is that the assumption that motion or becoming or any sort of change is, as the kids say nowadays, a thing, leads to logical contradictions, as in the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, or to an absurd conclusion. And this is true of all the paradoxes of Zeno that have survived. Some of them are more complicated than others, and frankly, some of them are just pretty silly, but all of them are aimed at showing that the assumption that motion and multiplicity exist leads logically to more absurd conclusions than Parmenides claims that they don't. The philosophy of Parmenides couldn't be sustained for very long, but it was influential. The philosophers who followed him were more focused than their predecessors on developing theories of how and why change occurs, so they wouldn't fall into the logical difficulties that Zeno noted. Empedocles, who was a generation younger than Parmenides and a generation older than Socrates, appears to have been persuaded to the extent that he interpreted Parmenides' views in a way that was more conducive to the world we perceive. Empedocles held that there are several types of basic principles, not just one. There's earth, air, fire, and water, the four elements as they came to be known, and that one type of element can never become another type. That's what's unchanging. So if the basic elements comprise everything that exists but can't be changed into each other, there needs to be a mechanism for transforming the things that those elements compose, the objects we perceive. Empedocles conceived those forces to be love and strife. And here's what he says. I will tell a double story. For at one time, they grew to be only one out of many. But at another, they grew apart to be many out of one. Fire and water and earth and the immense height of air and deadly strife apart from them, equal in all directions, and love among them, equal in depth and breadth. For these are all equal and of the same age, meaning the four elements, but each rules in its own province and possesses its own individual character. But they dominate in their turn as time revolves. And nothing is added to them or subtracted, for if they were perishing continuously, they would no longer be. Later in his poem, Empedocles states that love brings the elements together, as one can imagine, and strife tears them apart. The ultimate triumph of love appears to be when, quote, all these things come together to be one single thing, unquote, which is vaguely reminiscent of the one of Parmenides. But of course, Parmenides had no use for such a mechanism because he held that the one is eternal and unchanging. The reasons why Empedocles accepted or rejected various premises of Parmenides have to be inferred from his text, for he rarely makes clear statements about that. But I think this much can reliably be said. Given that he was convinced that motion does in fact exist, Empedocles needed to give an account of how this fact does not contradict pure logic. So he accepted Parmenides' claim that not being cannot exist, which in physical terms means there can be no such thing as a void or an empty space, right? Because that would be not being, a place where nothing is, which matter can move through. Therefore, the implication is everything must be full of matter, right? To Parmenides, this meant movement's impossible because nothing can move into a space that's already occupied. But Empedocles noted that this is not true. When air leaves a tube, for example, water enters and vice versa, which means movement is possible even if the entire universe is composed only of being, that is, if it's full. But that observation by itself is not sufficient to refute Parmenides, because it presupposes that the perception of air and water is correct. For this reason, or at least so we can conjecture, Empedocles realized that he also had to devise a theory of perception. His theory was that every object gives off tiny material particles which travel through the air, and when these particles touch our sense organs, we perceive the object. So Empedocles is starting to ask the question not only what do we know, but how do we know? So this is an essentially physical explanation, but it's overlaid with a poetic account of the initiators of change, namely love and strife, which at first glance seem to be similar to divine beings, such as those in Hesiod's Theogony, but which evidently are intended by Empedocles to refer to forces and not celestial beings. The last pre-Socratic philosopher we'll spend quality time on was Anaxagoras, and he appears to have made an important advance on Empedocles, who was his contemporary. Again, this is a generation, about the time of Socrates, a little bit older. While some of the details of Anaxagoras' theory are debated, he seems to have argued that the basic elements comprising the visible world are not perceptible material forms like Empedocles' four elements. In a nod to Parmenides, he held that being was originally one, but he differed in arguing that the one was composed of many imperceptible elements, which he called seeds, and that there were many more of them than Empedocles or anyone earlier had proposed. And here's what we have from Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, which is also in present-day Turkey, Asia Minor, near the Aegean Sea. All things were together. This is the origin according to Anaxagoras, unlimited in amount and in smallness, for the small too were unlimited. And because all things were together, nothing was evident on account of smallness, right? It's like having an object where you can't see the atoms or the molecules, one could say. And then another quote, also from Simplicius, who I mentioned earlier. Since these things are so, it's right to think that there are many different things present in everything that is being combined, and seeds of all things, having all sorts of forms, colors, and flavors, and that humans and all the other animals were compounded from these and so forth. So Anaxagoras' most important philosophical innovation was not about any of this business of composition, but it was about the kind of causation that allowed from change from the original one to the many, and then to the multitude of things that we perceive in our world. For that purpose, he introduced Nous, which translates as mind, and he claimed that organizes the entire universe. Nous, he said, is unlimited and self-ruling and has been mixed with no other thing, but is alone, itself, by itself. The world, Anaxagoras believed, is the product of wisdom and forethought, not of random motion. For this reason, Aristotle stated that Anaxagoras' introduction of Nous made him appear, quote, as a sober man among the random chatterers who preceded him, including all the previous pre-Socratics. And Plutarch, talking about Anaxagoras, and again, this is supposed to be Plutarch, writing 500 plus years later, said admiringly of Anaxagoras that, quote, "The men of those times called him by the name of Nous, that is, mind or intelligence, whether in admiration of the great and extraordinary gift he displayed for the science of nature, or because he was the first of the philosophers who did not refer the first ordering of the world to fortune or chance, nor to necessity or compulsion, but to a pure, unadulterated intelligence." Any assessment of Anaxagoras' philosophy will depend on some extent to how one regards the significance of this idea of nous or mind. If you're a scientific materialist, mind might appear to be just another irrelevant metaphysical entity, not substantially different from the love and strife of Empedocles, and perhaps not even from Zeus and Athena. But an idealist might hold the opposite opinion, namely that Anaxagoras' theory has the trappings of conscious causation, but is in fact a sort of disguised materialism. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, for example, this, by the way, is Plato, not Anaxagoras, Socrates reports he was initially delighted to hear about Anaxagoras' theories, but that his enthusiasm dimmed when he read Anaxagoras' work and discovered that, quote, "The man made no use of mind, nor gave it any responsibility for the management of things, but mentioned as causes air and ether and water and many other strange things." Socrates goes on to say that that's like saying that Socrates' actions are all due to his mind, but then accounting for everything he actually does by the state and movements of his body. Anaxagoras' successors, Leucippus and Democritus, I'll speak of them briefly, but they're important. They proposed a somewhat more sophisticated theory. In their view, the basic elements of the universe are atoms, from the Greek word atomos, which means uncuttable. Their account of these basic particulars bears some similarity to that of Anaxagoras, but aside from the fact that Anaxagoras thought that the basic elements could be cut or divided, in fact, infinitely apparently, their theory is much more detailed and much more overtly mechanistic. Leucippus and Democritus taught that there's an indefinite number of atoms with an indefinite number of shapes and sizes, and that those atoms comprise all the things that exist. They're in constant motion, stopping only when they become entangled with other atoms. Movement takes place through the void or empty space, so their account was very different from those of Parmenides or Empedocles, who denied that empty space could exist because it would be not being. Taking for granted that motion exists, the atomists argued that a void is necessary to allow it, since that which is full can't admit something else. So Leucippus and Democritus can be considered the distant forefathers of modern atomic theory, although their method, like that of all the pre-Socratics, was almost entirely non-empirical. They weren't looking at things and saying, "Oh, you can't cut this," right? Leucippus and Democritus were contemporaries of Socrates, so it seems appropriate to bring the account of the pre-Socratic philosophers to a close with them. There are others who are mostly for convenience's sake regarded as pre-Socratics, even though they lived at the same time as Socrates, or in some cases even a bit later. But we're getting close to out of time, and these are the ones I consider the most significant, particularly with respect to philosophy before Socrates. So almost everything I've conveyed so far about the philosophers who preceded Socrates had to do with their theories about nature, about the constitution and workings of the universe. Those are the subjects in which they were the most interested, and the ones in which it's easiest to trace the trajectory of their thought. But they had many other interests as well. Most of them addressed ethical topics, often linking them to their broader cosmological views. Pythagoras, aside from his influence in mathematics, founded a religious community that practiced rigid discipline in the pursuit of purity. Some of his teaching connected ethical behavior with harmony and cosmic order. According to the 3rd century Syrian philosopher Iamblichus, who wrote a biography of Pythagoras, Pythagoras taught that number is the wisest of all things, and harmony the most beautiful. He's also said to have believed that all living things are kin, which is reflected in this story. Once he passed by as a puppy was being beaten, the story goes, and in pity said these words, "Stop, do not beat him, since it's the soul of a man, a friend of mine," which I recognized when I heard it crying. As to other philosophers, I've already mentioned Xenophanes' rejection of the mythical gods on the basis of their unsavory actions, and his claim that to be wise is to be good. Heraclitus emphasized the harmony of, quote, things at variance, and the importance of living in accordance with the logos, which for him meant something like universal universal reason or divine law. As he wrote, "All human beings are nourished by one law, the divine law, for it has as much power as it wishes and is sufficient for all." That was Heraclitus. And ethical living, in his view, meant recognizing how the universe operates and striving for true self-awareness, which he believed hardly anyone had. Empedocles introduced the idea of love and strife as cosmic forces, as I mentioned, and that suggested not only a theory of nature, but also a theory of ethical conduct, encouraging unity and harmony. His poem occasionally notes that joy abounds when people come together in love, and that strife, which leads to weeping and wailing, is thereby banished, at least for a time, although there's no hint in his poem that strife can be banished forever. Anaxagoras went further in the direction of unity. His notion of the primordial oneness of the universe, of a universe that's become fragmented, along with a divine and benign nous, or mind, that's in charge of the universe, led him to the view that we humans should recognize our interconnectedness, and that we're intended to live a life of reason and moderation. The virtues of Anaxagoras' character, as documented by Plutarch and others, seem to have included a generosity of spirit that they found consistent with his philosophy. And Democritus anticipated the ethical views that were later championed by the Roman writer Lucretius, whose book on the nature of the universe is a classic defense of atomism, in exhorting people, as Democritus did and Lucretius would later, not to be disturbed by fear or superstition. So, to conclude, the range of pre-Socratic thought shows that the earliest Greek philosophers were not merely students of nature, although that was the primary focus for almost all of them. In addition to ethics, their interests extended to the nature of perception, mathematics, astronomy, the nature of explanation, and many other subjects. The later pre-Socratics showed an interest in the structure of the human body, anticipating the works of Hippocrates and other practitioners of ancient medicine, some of whom were their contemporaries. All of them passed on what later became many of the basic concerns of philosophy to the likes of Plato and Aristotle, and ultimately to the whole tradition of Western thought. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you, David. Sorry, I'm just adding a spotlight to myself there. So we have a number of questions. It's possible that we'll get to all of them, but we'll see if you've asked a question and I am not able to bring it up. My apologies in advance. And please accept my apologies if I mispronounce any names. So the first one is from Fred Strasheim. Fred asks, what distinctive cultural and intellectual characteristics of early Greek society enabled the pre-Socratic thinkers to develop forms of philosophical speculation that were fundamentally different from other modes of thought in the ancient world at that time? It seems like something really unique was happening at that particular time and in that particular place.
Yeah. Generally speaking, in the 6th century BC, this doesn't occur as much later, the towns around Asia Minor were relatively, for that era, peaceful, and some of them, particularly Miletus, as I mentioned, affluent. And this sort of thing was conducive to intellectual speculation. There are issues that come up later on. I mentioned that as time went on, many of these philosophers wound up journeying to Athens, sometimes living there for a time. Because of Athens' status, after the Persian Wars, particularly as the dominant city of the Greek world, really, where the arts were thought was generally speaking encouraged. Now, obviously, Socrates gets executed. There are limits to all these kinds of things, right? But I'm not really a social historian. So what I can say is that it seemed that the times, generally speaking, in which there was more affluence and less conflict were ones that were more conducive to philosophic thought. But there are intrinsic matters of considering, I would say, the actions of the gods that I would say almost inevitably would lead to speculation about their relationship to human beings and ultimately their virtue. But those do come up under certain circumstances in history. Sorry, I can't do better. It's not a main subject for me.
Thank you, David. Gary Lansman asked, Heraclitus was a great proponent of the nature of change, particularly its constant nature. What were his most important ideas on how to deal with the effects of constant change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we have from Heraclitus is a number of fragments, and we're probably familiar with you can't step in the same river twice because the waters are overflowing. I mean, change is, if there's a constant in the world for Heraclitus, it's change. And so the issue about what Heraclitus believed, other than things like, as I quoted, one should follow the divine law, the other things have to do with self-awareness, which he thought very few people had. I mean, he's, aside from his criticizing of these major characters that I mentioned, like Hecataeus and Pythagoras and Xenophanes, he constantly says, many men do not recognize the logos. But he says, what's true is true not because of me, but because of the logos. So there's something about, I almost want to say, grokking the universe, just having the self-awareness. And he says, I looked into myself, right? And it seems that if one puts all this together, that if one steps away from what is commonly believed and kind of looks inward, right? And I suppose you could say meditates and ponders on this, one will become enlightened. And what enlightenment leads to, his sort of ethical political statements tend to be very unhelpful in this regard. Like, well, this one country kicked out this great guy, and he was better than any of them. It would have been better if they were all kicked out. Things that you can't really make an ethical statement about, but do seem to promote virtue. But what counts as virtue for Heraclitus? I didn't even bother to speculate because it's hard for me to tell. At times he says, things like war is the father of all. It mostly seems to be that if you recognize the truths of the universe, the logos, you will move in the right direction, whatever that is. But I can't really tell you more about what that direction is.
All right. So how to deal with the effects of constant change? Understand it, at least. When
Yes.
something follows from that's salutary, but who knows what.
Yes.
Thanks, David. So Clinton Stockwell, Graham School's own Clinton Stockwell asks, he says, I've done some research on Cicero. Cicero, argues that the philosophers before Socrates are better than those who followed because they, that is, those who followed, combined rhetoric with political engagement and did not understand philosophy to be purely abstract and uninvolved with civic life. Do you agree with Cicero's assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is almost like a Platonic point, that Cicero is making here, what these earlier philosophers were doing, and I would say certainly to more or less of an extent, because there are definitely variations in them, but is to try to achieve, kind of pure wisdom. And that's clearly the goal of Socrates as we see him, especially in the Platonic dialogues, but probably also in the works of Xenophanes and others who wrote about Socrates. Xenophanes. Xenophon, sorry, Plato's contemporary. So the notion I mean, we have in Plato's dialogues sort of the same suspicion that we get from Cicero, is that these people are claiming to be pure philosophers, but really they're getting paid and they're getting audiences and they're full of themselves, and things like that. And I suspect that's part of what Cicero is referring to. Although I don't know. I wonder if there's a follow-up question that maybe focuses that. If there's more from Cicero,
Well,
but I
let me
can
clarify.
understand.
So it seems like
Yeah.
what Clinton is saying is Cicero's position is the philosophers before Socrates did
Hmm.
pretty well to understand
Hmm.
philosophy as purely abstract and uninvolved with civic life. The
Yeah.
contrast is with those
Hmm.
who followed Socrates, who
Hmm.
combined rhetoric with political engagement and presumably mixed up their philosophical work with
Hmm.
political engagement and rhetoric. So, I don't know if what appears in Plato, if there's a critique of the pre-Socratic philosophers along these lines, it lines
Hmm.
up with Cicero's critique of post-Socratic philosophers along these lines.
Right.
What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like Cicero is pretty much castigating the sophists as claiming to be philosophers, but really involving other things. Now, maybe they weren't the kinds of things that Plato is talking about, but that this was not, I suppose you could say, pure philosophy, the philosophy of the sophists, and even those after him. For the Stoics, Epicureans, Academy. I mean, hard to know who all Cicero's referring to, but the notion that pure philosophy should be an unpolluted abstract discipline seems to be what Cicero is aiming at, and saying that after Socrates, Plato, philosophers weren't interested in that. Now, to some extent, of course, that's that's Plato's fault, right? Because we no longer get with Plato all this sort of uh, speculation about the origin of the universe until very late in his works. Mostly it's like, well, what's really important is how should you live? And the issue of ethics and to some extent politics um, becomes important. But I think as a consequence, I think Cicero might say, as a consequence of his philosophy, not as mixed up with it. So, mhm.
Thank you, David. There's a
Mhm.
question that builds on Clinton's question from John
Mhm.
Lockhart. John says, it's been proposed that Socrates so dominated thinking after him, thinking to this day, that diversity in philosophical thought was narrower as a result of Socrates' influence. Thus, there's great interest in pre-Socratic philosophers due to their freedom, if you will, from Socratic bias. What do you think? Do you agree?
Whoa. Oh gosh. Um, Yeah, boy, that's something that we could discuss for a very long time. I don't know that I think, I mean, certainly the influence of Plato was phenomenal. Um, and I would say it's very hard to find a major philosophic school in the late Hellenistic period that was not claiming Socrates, not only indebted to Plato, but sort of claiming Socrates as kind of an example of what rightness of thought involved. Um, I don't know that I think the pre-Socratic philosophers um, were particularly freer. I think they were kind of constrained in a kind of a different way. Um, to me, one could look at much of pre-Socratic philosophy, and I've really emphasized the differences and the departure and the kind of the transition, and I think that's really important for mythological thinking. But it appears that their ability to really liberate themselves from mythological thinking was very labored in most cases. Empedocles, in terms of the composition origin of the universe, is a major advance from the Meletan philosophers. But then it's like, well, it's love and strife. You get these kind of um, sort of neo um, mythological concepts that you really don't get anymore, or you don't get them in any serious way after, in the later period, certainly after Aristotle. So I don't know that in terms of freedom, I will say this, that the past, I would say, roughly century has been a reevaluation of the pre-Socratics along the lines that were suggested, that their innovations were really, really significant. They weren't just these kind of like kids playing with their blocks, and then Socrates and Plato and Aristotle picked them up and made them into an edifice. That these were really, really major issues they dealt with. And I think that's really true. The sophistication of their philosophies was not very great by the comparison with later philosophies, including those highly influenced by Plato. So, yeah, that's about what I can say about that. I'm not sure I agree. I certainly don't entirely disagree.
Well, we've set you up for your next lecture then, David. It's a big topic. Thank you for the lecture. Thank you for those answers. My apologies again to anyone whose questions I did not get to. We will close out by repeating what has become a basic program tradition for these First Friday lectures. I am going to ask you all to unmute in a moment, and we will pretend that we're all together in a material lecture hall. And I'll ask you to thank David with your clapping and your acclaim. So here we go.
You don't unmute.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bravo.
everyone. Really appreciate you coming and
No.
your attention. Thanks very much.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
you.
Thanks so much.